Howdy. Welcome to another session of Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. I'm Cousin Donnie Lee, sitting in for the great doctor. Won't you join me as we sprint down the hall of knowledge? As today, we's fixing to study about that German monk feller whose name is none other than Martin Luther. All right? And won't you join me for a frosty beverage of Coke Zero? Won't you join me? All right. So this is the second installment of the Protestant Reformation video. All right. Section, what we call 3.1b. All right. And as we discuss the teachings of Martin Luther, in our previous video, we discussed some of the criticisms of the Catholic Church, such as clerical immorality, clerical ignorance, and clerical pluralism. All right, and so today we're going to talk about the man who is responsible for bringing the Protestant Reformation and the divide amongst Christian religion, so that no longer would Europe be united by Christianity or Catholicism. Okay, so Martin Luther was a fella who, born in 1483 to a German family, lived inside the Holy Roman Empire that's seen right here in this map. All right, and much to his father's chagrin, he decided that after his a stint at the university, he was, I guess he had come to the conclusion that he had a calling, okay? And that's what the Catholics call a vocation. And so he decided to join the monastery and become a monk. And he joined the Augustinians. Okay, and so the story behind that goes that when he was visiting home, he was caught in a ferocious thunderstorm, and that he had made a vow that if he would be saved and delivered without harm, that he would give his life over to God. And that is a little interesting story, because that kind of illustrates some of the superstition that existed amongst these medieval Europeans. Okay, so he entered the monastic order of the Augustinians, named after that early Christian feller's name, whose name is Augustina Hippo. All right, so at any rate, one of the things that's most interesting was Martin's obsession with, or preoccupation with, salvation. Okay, and the teaching at the time was that, and we went over this, like I said in the video yesterday, that there was a formula, all right, by which one receives salvation, okay, and earns salvation. And what you have to do is you have to receive the 7 sacraments, and by doing so, you receive God's grace, and that if you do good deeds and good works, that this is how one achieves salvation. But scriptures, especially the Old Testament, was something that kind of terrified Martin, young Martin, and he was angry at God, because he saw God as a punishing type deity, and he felt like no matter how hard he tried, and he was extremely devout, which is he was very pious, and that no matter what he did, that in God's eyes he was still sinful. All right, and so that there would be no way that he could earn salvation, and this was gravely troubling to the young Martin. Okay, his superiors were concerned about young Martin, and so they found in him that he had a brilliant mind, and so they sent him off to continue his education, and he received a doctorate in theology, which means he got him some Bible learning. Okay, and he became a teacher or a professor at a brand new university in northeastern Germany, I guess, or the Holy Roman Empire, called the University of Wittenberg. Okay? So, now, this troubling experience that he had, as far as his questioning whether or not he would ever be able to earn salvation, was one that finally was able to be rectified when he came across the writings of St. Paul of Tarsus. All right? And St. Paul came after Jesus and is responsible for establishing Catholic churches throughout the Near East and kind of helping to solidify what the beliefs of the early church were. And included in that were the ideas associated with salvation. And what y'all going to find out is that the early teachings of salvation ain't got nothing to do with what the medieval church had to say about how one earned salvation. Okay? And so it's essentially this idea that God, in his love for humanity, all right, previously had closed down heaven after Adam and Eve had eaten from the forbidden fruit. And so the Catholic Church taught that everybody was stuck in purgatory because of that. And that when God sent his Son, he sent his Son to save all of mankind from our wickedness. All right? And so that when Jesus died for our sins, that the gates of heaven had been opened. All right? And so in order for one to join Jesus in paradise, it was simply necessary for one to believe. All right? Believe that Jesus came and died for our sins. Okay? And if you truly believe that, then you have received God's grace. And therefore, you are worthy of salvation. Because the gift that is salvation is too great. You're talking about eternity in paradise. You can't put a price tag on that because there's nothing a man could do that could earn that. There's nothing a man or a person could do that could be deserving of such an awesome gift. So, don't think of it in those terms. Y'all got to think of it in terms of just got to receive that gift, okay? There's a little bit more to that, and I'll talk about it as we go on. But there are three interconnected beliefs or tenets that Martin Luther begins to play around with, okay? And these are going to become the bedrock of his faith and pretty much Protestantism for the most part, okay? And so I'm going to throw some Latin terms at you, so don't get all frightened, all right? But the first one is sola fide. Sola fide is basically by faith alone. By faith alone, we are saved, okay? And that's just what I was explaining earlier, this idea that it's a gift that one needs to receive. So you just got to have faith. You got to believe that God so loved the world, he sent his only Son to die for our sins, and that he is our Savior, okay? And that we can't do anything ourselves without his grace, his love. Okay, the second one is what's called sola scriptura. The only way that one can develop their faith is by scriptures alone, okay? And so you can say all day long, I got faith in God, but if you're not reading scriptures, you ain't, developing that faith of yours and nourishing it. So you got to, on a regular basis, read the Bible, which was contrary to what the church had been teaching at the time, because the church said that the Bible was complicated because there was tremendous symbolism, and that only a theologian should read the Bible, or that only with the assistance of a theologian should a layperson dare try to read something. All right, because they could be led down the primrose path to destruction and fire and brimstone, hellfire, stuff like that. Anyway, so sola scriptura, and we're going to kind of expand upon that idea in just a moment, because the church at this point in time has been teaching that the Pope is the ultimate authority. Okay? If we go back a couple chapters to unum sanctum, the church is, or every institution, including secular powers, are subordinate to the papacy. So the Catholic Church at the time is saying that the Pope's ideas are, well, more relevant and more valid than that of the good book itself. Okay, and then the third was this idea of sola gratia. Okay, which just means essentially that we're all the same. Okay, now when we look, and I showed you in the video from before, the previous video, that there is a church hierarchy, and that church hierarchy symbolizes that chastity, taking a vow of chastity, is superior to all others, and that devoting your life to God is more important than anything else, like a vocation or calling that you can have. And so, as such, members of the clergy, they have special powers. We talked a little bit about the mojo yesterday. We're going to fix it and talk about that too, a little bit, expand on that mojo, or their ability to perform miracles on an everyday basis. Okay, I mean they can raise the dead or even heal the sick, but there are some miracles that clergy members have the capability of performing. And as I said, I lovingly refer to that miraculous power as the mojo. All right, but anyway, the church kind of taught that clergy members were superior to that of the lay people, at least spiritually speaking. Okay, and so there's this hierarchy, and the people are at the bottom. According to Martin Luther, we all's equal in the eyes of God. All right, we all of us is sinful, we all wicked, and we're all incapable of saving ourselves. It's only through Jesus. All right, and that's quite contrary to what the medieval church had been teaching, because the parish priest, their responsibility was to guarantee the salvation of the flock of their parishioners. Okay, so those are the three most important beliefs that you're ever going to hear in your entire life. I tell you what. Okay, so if all of this is true, that Martin Luther, what he is espousing, or what he has developed in his mind, he's going to be on a collision course with the church in Rome, and that's exactly where we head. We heading to a fight. There's going to be a fight. All right. So we already learned that there were some criticisms of the Catholic Church. We already learned that there was some shortcomings when we were talking about pluralism and immorality, and you got clergy members breaking their vows of chastity and poverty and whatnot. Okay, but the thing that's really going to be the nail in the coffin, or the straw that breaks the camel's back, is going to be this indulgence controversy. Okay, and so in the previous video, I talked about purgatory, and that how when you commit sins, even though you receive forgiveness of your sins, when you receive the sacrament of reconciliation, that's when you go to confession and you talk to the priest, and you, with a contrite heart, you ask for forgiveness, and the priest has the mojo to forgive your sins, but the stain of that sin remains. And then he gives you a penance. And that penance, like I said, could be prayer, good works, or alms given to the poor, or the church for that matter. And then that would be what is necessary to wipe that stain. See, because you got that, like when you spill mustard or something on your shirt, and then you throw it in the dryer and it sets, and that's you ain't getting it out. And the only way you're gonna get that out is if you take it to the cleaners. Okay, and so that penance is like them rubbing some, what they call that shout, where they shout it out. All right, so think of it in terms of that. Okay, and so the penance that you perform is going to help you avoid the fire of purgatory, and so that your soul could be reunited with Jesus and his mama Mary in heaven. Okay, and so the Catholic Church kind of came up with this idea that, okay, now this is crazy, okay? Hold on. So I'm going to tell you what happened, then we're going to go back, all right? So Pope Leo the X, Pope Leo the X, he, in an attempt to start raising some money, okay, in part, and there's another reason too, he needed to raise some money for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Now, we done learned that when we studied the Renaissance that it was Michelangelo who developed the, the dome right here, and that he also painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, right? Somebody else, that was Michelangelo. They hired other artists to do the other 15 chapels, but the Sistine Chapel was done by none other than Michelangelo. So to pay for all this, they had to come up with some funding, okay? St. Peter, he's known as the first bishop of Rome and therefore the first pope. Peter, Jesus said to him, "You are the rock upon which I will build my church, saith the Lord." Okay. So now we've got this feller named Albert of Hohenzollern. What the heck is a Hohenzollern? Well, we're going to learn about them crazy people in a couple chapters. They're going to establish the Prussian kingdom. Not Russia, but Prussia. Okay? But the Hohenzollern family we'll learn about. But this feller was offered to his third ecclesiastical position to become the Archbishop of Mainz. Mainz. That's the same place that feller Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1440 or 1450, somewhere circa in between there. But anyway, it was going to be his third such position. So that feller, he was going to have him 3 ecclesiastical positions. And you know what's funny? This feller ain't a member of the clergy. He is a secular fella. He is a lay person. And so in order to pay for that, he got to raise all kinds of money. Okay, and so he had to borrow some money from this banking family known as the Fuggers. Now, I know some of you got dirty minds and want to pronounce that some other way, but don't you dare. Don't you dare. Not in my presence. All right. So anyway, in order to pay that, the Pope said that he could sell some indulgences as long as he went in with the Pope 50-50. So the 50% of the money that they raised in the Holy Roman Empire selling these indulgences, 50% of them are going to go down to Rome to help pay for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, and then the other 50% is going to go to help pay off his loans. And who we talking about? This fella right here, Albert of Hohenzollern. Got it? Archbishop of Mainz. All right? So this handsome devil right here, he's a friar. Notice that the fact he's got himself a double chin. Remember what I said about the controversy with the immorality and the breaking of their vows? Remember these fellas had to take a vow of poverty. Well, those mendicant orders like to beg and use the money that they would get that they were supposed to use to administer to the poor, and they would use it for things that they would ingest themselves. And so it is not surprising that this man has a little problem with his weight because he likes to overindulge. But this handsome fella, his name is Johann Tetzel, all right? And he is one of the Dominicans. That's one of those Dominican orders we was talking about. But anyway, he was hired to be the person to peddle these indulgences. And he had all kinds of, autonomy, okay? Like, he had a wide berth given to him as far as what the conditions of the sales and what he was allowed to say, okay? As far as what the conditions of the indulgences were, okay? So again, this was a way to get rid of the time that the stain of the sin. So we got to go back a little bit and talk about the early history of the church back to the Crusades in 1095. All right. Pope Urban II was the Pope at the time when it became important for the church to regain the Holy Land in Jerusalem, Palestine. All right. And one of the ways that they motivated Christian warriors to do that was that they would promise salvation. Okay. So the idea was if they go down there to the Middle East and they fight and die for their faith, fighting a holy war against the infidels, that they would be guaranteed salvation as long as the sins that they had committed, they were contrite for. All right? Because they don't exactly have an opportunity if they're all fighting to do their penance. Okay? And so this was kind of a get out of jail free card, if you will. Well, in 1343, Pope Clement, and this is during that time period known as the Avignon Papacy, discovered that there was a treasury of merit that existed in heaven, and this is important. So that means that Jesus and all the saints had done so many good deeds, they're like all these extras just lying around waiting for people to access them. And that if through prayer, if you access these good deeds, they could come down, all right, and be used to wipe away the stain from the soul so that it can enter into heaven and have to get to skip over purgatory. Okay? So the church began to sell these, and this is a beginning sign of the corruption that exists, because you may remember the Avignon Papacy was broke, y'all, and they had to get clever on how they raise money. So selling these indulgences was one of them. Okay? Now, in 1476, there's a further evolution with regard to the sale of indulgences, and then what this Pope Sixtus the IV said, well, I know it said fourth, but IV sounds funny. Okay, he extended indulgences to basically anybody. All right, so you could purchase, now these indulgences cost money. The churches ain't just giving them out for free, man. They got to get paid. Okay, you got to make a donation to the church. It's funny how they call it a donation when you ain't going to get it unless you pay for it. To me, that ain't a donation. That's a charge, but whatever. Anyway, you could, if you had a dead relative and you were concerned that they were in purgatory, you could purchase one of these indulgences for them, and then they get sprung out of purgatory, and then they get their wings, man, and they get to go up to heaven with God, with Mary and all the saints and Jesus, okay, for eternal paradise. So I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so this, as one might imagine, can be an area where people grow a little skeptical. And as we're leaving, the time period known as the Middle Ages, where people were superstitious and whatnot, there's an increased rate of education. There is a more educated middle class, if you will, and they reading this stuff and they said, that don't sound right. That sounds kind of foolish to me and certainly corrupt. But there was no shortage of people, because the vast majority of the people was, not very bright, pretty illiterate. And so, and because they wanted to believe it, because salvation was something that was so important to so many people during this time period that they wanted to believe it. Okay, so, so anyway, there's this idea floating around so they send Johann Tetzel to go throughout the Holy Roman Empire selling these indulgences. Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. Okay, because inside where Wittenberg, the university there, that Martin Luther is teaching as a professor, it falls inside of this place called Saxony. All right, and there's this fellow by the name, he's a prince, Frederick the Wise. Okay, Frederick of Saxony. He is one of the great electors. Okay, remember, he one of the 7 electors that gets to decide and vote on who the next Holy Roman Emperor is going to be. So he's a man of influence. Well, here's the deal. That guy, as it said in the notes earlier, that he had 19,000 relics, okay? And like I said in the previous video, if you're going to go and pay to go and see some relics, that's another vehicle by which you can receive God's grace, okay? Does that make sense? You're going to receive God's grace, all right? The indulgences, that's kind of like the ultimate. form of God's grace. But the seeing the relics, well, that gets some of your time off of purgatory. They're like, miniature indulgences, if you will. So that man had a big collection, 19,000, and he was setting right before All Souls Day on November 1st. He was getting ready to, put these on display and allow all the people to come out and view them and make donations to the church. But when Johann Tetzel began selling these indulgences, no one was really interested, okay? That's like if you go to the carnival, all right? And then right next door, there's a guy that's got, carnival opens, and then and everybody's paying money to go ride on the Ferris wheel. Well, people will be excited about that, but then what if next door some guy comes along and he says, I got me a fire-breathing dragon inside this tent, and you got to pay money to come see this fire-breathing dragon, and we're going to, burn all kinds of things and put them on fire. People like fire, and they like things getting burnt up. So most people probably wouldn't go to the ride the Ferris wheel because they want to go see that fire-breathing dragon. You know what I'm saying? So Johann Tetzel is like that fire-breathing dragon. And so Frederick the Wise is mad because that means no money for him. Okay? See how that works? All right. So for Luther, this was just absolutely ridiculous, and he was tired of the church, the corrupt church in Rome, stealing the good German people's money. And so he decided to take a stand and do something about it. And this is a historic moment, okay? Because Martin Luther, folks, he's probably the most important figure of the 16th century, most historically significant. So this is a big deal. So on October 31st, which is Halloween, y'all, 1517, and we's fixing this is 2017 right now when I'm recording this video, and it's October 2nd. So just by the end, within a month, we're going to be celebrating the 500th anniversary. I'm so excited. I'm going to get me a special robe, and see, he's a friar, so he's got this haircut where they shave the inside of their head. I call it a reverse mohawk. I'm going to get me one of them, and I'm going to bring me my robe and some 95 Theses to school, and I'm going to walk around. Yep, you want to be a part of it, you can. It'll be fun. We'll get on the news. But think we crazy. All right. Where are we at? 95 Theses. So he had, that kind of reminds me of who is that guy? A Jay-Z song? I got 95 problems and you ain't one. Well, maybe that's the wrong number. I don't know. But anyway, so he posted his grievances that he had against the church, the Catholic Church in Rome, most specifically the Pope, and the Pope not having the authority to do what he said with these indulgences. That the Pope, and if the Pope did have the authority, why wouldn't he? If he's the vicar of Christ, God's represented on earth, why don't he free everybody? Why don't he just open up purgatory and let everybody get their wings? Now that would be a very gracious thing to do. Okay, so he is very cynical about the Pope's motives. Okay, for this selling of these indulgences. So he posts the 95. So that marks, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, and that is when the unification of Christendom is coming to an end. It's gonna be kaput before too long. All right. So he says, look, y'all, it doesn't have anything to do with that. That means the person with the most money can guarantee their salvation. And that just is not at all the way it's supposed to be, okay? So it is a deeply flawed and corrupt system, okay? So all kinds of people stopped buying the indulgences because of what Martin Luther stated, all right? Because he was so outspoken and very popular in Wittenberg. And so somebody had taken his ideas and used a printing press to make copies of it, and they started to disseminate those writings. And so the sale of indulgences in Saxony tanked, okay? And other people, I mean, that's just one effect, but the other effect was that his words and his criticisms of the Catholic Church began to spread among educated people throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? So, one of the things that was problematic, though, was that Prince Albert of Saxony, or of Hohenzollern, was deeply concerned because this was going to impact his ability to repay his loans. And so he sends word to Frederick, telling Frederick that he needs to put a muzzle on Martin Luther and shut him up, because he's got to make this money back so he can pay off the banking family, so that he can take that third ecclesiastical position. All right. So there's all kinds of political things that are going to take place, y'all. And this is going to get a little confusing, but there's all kinds of political things that happen that make it possible for Protestantism to survive. And one of them is the selection of a new Holy Roman Emperor. Maximilian the First, he's Holy Roman Emperor. He dies in January 1519. Okay? Now, the election process pits two people. All right? The grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, okay, is one. He is in line. His name is Charles. Okay, now he's going to become the king of Spain, so he'll be known as Carlos the First, and then he's going to be kind of competing against the king in France named Francis the First, who wants also to be the Holy Roman Emperor. So what these fellas got to do is they got to basically bribe their way to the throne, okay, and make all kinds of promises and bribes to the 7 electors to get there. And so Carlos and then Charles, because he's going to be the king of Spain and then all the vast territories in the New World, this is a very, very powerful individual. All right, and it's kind of scary to the Germanic princes, and they don't want him to be too powerful to where he can unify the Holy Roman Empire and squeeze these guys out of power. So they get a list of conditions from him, okay, and he agrees to all of them. And they're basically these promises that he says, I'm going to let you have a legislative body, okay, that frequently meets, and we're going to call it the Diet, all right? The Diet, it's a legislative body in the Holy Roman Empire. So Charles agrees to that. He says, okay, I'll do that. And then the other thing is, he says, anytime I have a very serious decision, like a big decision to make on whether it's domestic or even foreign affairs, I'm going to consult the Diet, okay? And that means I'm going to bring all them 7 electors in, and even some of the other princes, because there's about 300 principalities within the Holy Roman Empire at this time, that he will call in a Diet, and he won't do anything unilaterally. He will advise, use the legislative body, the Diet, for advice and consent. Okay? So those agreements are going to prevent or allow, Martin Luther to survive, because Martin Luther should have followed the same fate of a Jan Hus, or even that feller, that other friar, what the heck, Dominican, Savonarola in Florence. All right, remember that guy? He got burnt up. Remember, he had the bonfire of the vanities. Okay, so this is the territory that he's going to inherit, or what he's going to become leader of. So this is Spain, and then this is territory within the Holy Roman Empire that he directly rules over. Now, this red line represents all the territory that's in it, but some of it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to other people. But this is all the territory that he's going to control. So he's a very powerful fella. Okay? Okay. Now, the Lob-EZ debate, it's sort of important, but it's where he gets, Martin Luther gains a little bit more notoriety and begins to really challenge more sternly the idea of having a pope in general. Now, you may recall it was Marsiglio of Padua that was the first to really kind of do that. but he got excommunicated too. But there's a debate that he was called or summoned to, and he has it against this scholar, and in it he mentions that the Pope is not infallible, that in fact Jan Hus, who was a convicted heretic and burned at the stake at the Council of Constantine in 1415, didn't deserve to, that he was more or less a victim. All right, and so these are very scandalous and controversial things to say, and so he's just playing with fire. Okay, so here are three pamphlets or books that Martin Luther wrote. You don't need to remember the names of them, but you do need to kind of understand that he's laying out what's going to make up the dogma, okay, the belief system of the Lutheran Church. Okay, so address to the Christian nobility, he basically says that the church is superior. Subordinate, that the church is subordinate to secular power, that the governments that are inside the Holy Roman Empire have a right to oversee, okay, the church. And then on the Babylonian captivity of the church, he attacks the 7 sacraments that the Catholic Church uses as vehicles to receive God's grace. And he said, look, there's really only 2 that are mentioned in the Bible: baptism and Eucharist. Okay, so we didn't talk about Eucharist right now. Okay, so because this is a big deal, because we was talking about the mojo that the priest has when it comes to forgiving sins, y'all. The biggest and the most important of the sacraments is Eucharist. Okay, and as I said, this is the focal point for Catholics. For other Christians or Protestants, when they go to church, it's the message, all right? It's the homily or the sermon. But for Catholics, it's just about receiving the Eucharist, because they believe, all right, that on the altar, the priest performs his mojo, okay? And this mojo is called transubstantiation, okay? So they believe, okay, that when the priest is up there and then he says repeats a lot of the things that Jesus said to his 12 apostles on the night that he was arrested, okay, before he was crucified. He said, do this in memory of me, all right? And this elaborate ceremony was developed where he shared bread and wine with his apostles. They broke bread together. They had a meal together. And that he said he wanted to memorialize this so that every time they gathered, they should perform this ceremony, and that Jesus, by doing so, will be physically within the Eucharist, which is unleavened bread, okay? And that is known as the miracle of transubstantiation. So the priest hits it with his mojo, okay? And some say lightning bolts shoot out his fingertips, and there's like a laser show that goes on. No, not really, but that would be cool, wouldn't it? Anyway, some probably people are thinking I'm being blasphemous, so I have to be a little respectful, and I don't mean to be. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I get it, all right? So I will be respectful. Anyway, the belief is that that Christ is physically present, okay, and that he is physically present. That the priest has transformed the the inner part of the Eucharist and the wine. That on the surface it appears to be wine, it appears to be bread, but on the inside it is miraculously the substance of Jesus, okay? And that they are physically taking him into their body. And that is the spiritual nourishment that Catholics find so important, okay? So Martin Luther says, nope, that's not true. That's not right. The priest is just like everybody else, all right? Is a priesthood of all believers. We're all on the same page, sola gratia. That don't mean they don't have any special powers. And he said this about God or Jesus' presence within the Eucharist. He said this. He said, look, y'all, Jesus is everywhere. All right? So Jesus was in the bread and wine even before the priest said anything special. So he calls it consubstantiation, that Jesus is, he's in everything. Okay, he's in this piece of paper, this table, is my Coke Zero, and so there's nothing special, that no miracle, that so priest ain't got no mojo, is what that's saying. All right, so the word is spreading. He's getting more and more popular. So the Pope, is starting to get alerted to his ideas, and so he sends out a papal bull, Exsurge Domini, Domini, arise, O Lord. And in it was very vicious attack against Luther, and basically said anybody who follows Luther is endangering their own soul. Okay, and remember what happened to Savonarola. He got burned at the stake by the Florentines because he got excommunicated, right? And his followers vacated him because his followers were threatened with excommunication as well. Okay? And so all of his political support went out the window, and that's how he ended up getting burned at the stake. But the same thing don't happen with Martin Luther. All right? He's got too many supporters, and he's got a lot of interested princes because they're tired of seeing all their hard-earned money and the money of their subjects go down to Rome. Okay? So this is kind of like, they're starting to see Rome as kind of like a foreign body, okay? And we call that a little bit of nationalism. All right? So he was given 60 days to recant, and they said, basically all of his teachings need to be burned in the fire. So he said, well, I can do the same thing. So he took the papal bull in a public ceremony. He threw that thing in a fire. All right? And this was quite a moment, okay? So a new bull came, a new papal bull came, and he was excommunicated. All right? And so the Pope now is putting pressure on the Holy Roman Emperor to do something about this monk or priest who has become a thorn in his side. So they hold themselves a diet, an imperial diet. Have the Emperor Charles, Chucky V, calls it himself. And it's at the city of Worms. Okay? And now remember, he could have arrested, he should have arrested, but to get elected, he had to say he wouldn't do stuff like that. He wouldn't act unilaterally. And so they were going to have to vote on this. And so Luther comes in, he's summoned, and he is ordered by the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Chucky V, to recant and take back everything that he said. And Luther says, unless you can prove to me where in scriptures or by common sense I have said something that is erroneous or somehow flawed, I cannot and will not recant what I have said. So help me God. All right. Now the Diet of Worms was adjourned, and before they could render a decision, because they all had to vote, Luther was allowed to leave, and then he got, quote unquote, kidnapped by Frederick the Wise, because Frederick the Wise liked Luther. He very much was a strong supporter, and he didn't want Luther to go down that way. And so he's part of the reason. Now, what was it about Luther that Frederick liked? Well, he probably liked his ideas, okay? His ideas of faith, his dogma, all right? Because Frederick was devout himself. But probably more important than that, he liked the idea that local princes had supremacy over the church. And that also meant, from an economic standpoint, no more money unnecessarily is going to go down to Rome. Okay, so I think it's a complex issue, and there's a lot of reasons. But he kidnaps him, all right, and whisks him away to one of his distant castles and says, you need to stay here until things cool off. All right, and Martin Luther does so and takes the version of the New Vulgate that his friend Erasmus had written or translated to translate the Bible or the New Testament into German. Because reading the Bible is important. And so most people didn't know Latin. They only knew German. So he spent a year in hiding, and then when he came out, he found that his church had been organized and people were basically using his ideas to begin to preach. All right? So some of the ideas that Martin Luther had in order to kind of create a new church was one that he needed the support for this to last and to spread. He needed the support of the local princes. And so it was very important, and Martin Luther's no dummy, okay? He basically says that the church is subordinate to secular powers, and that people, okay, have to follow secular authority. And he does a good job of quoting scriptures and saying, the Bible says you do not have a right to, in no case do you have a right to rise up in armed insurrection or revolution or rebellion or whatever you want to call it against the secular authorities. That the secular authorities have been given their authority by God. Because in the Bible it says, there's a specific scene when Jesus is being questioned by the Sanhedrin. What is their responsibility to Rome? And Jesus says, give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And Martin Luther's interpretation of that is that you have to follow the law. And even if you have a tyrant for a leader, you cannot attempt to overthrow him. That is your cross that you have to bear. And you have no authority to do any of that. All right? And that's very... It makes sense because he needed the support of all of those local princes and leaders, because otherwise his church, Lutheranism, doesn't get off the ground. All right? He decides, and some people take this to be the ultimate humiliation to the church, because he decides to take an ex-nun, him being an ex-priest, he decides to take an ex-nun as his wife, Katharina von Bora, and they have children together. And we're going to start talking about some of the importance that Protestants place on marriage. And they say that marriage is a more blessed state than is chastity. Okay? Because the Catholic Church taught that, lust is sinful, and, having sex other than for the purpose of procreation is sinful. The best way to be was to remain chaste, all right? Go without sex. But Martin Luther said marriage is the most sacred union, or I guess condition, that a person could take, okay? All right. You'll have to forgive me, but Leland sees something outside, and he's getting rather excited. He sees some of the children from the neighborhood are getting off the bus. So he's getting all worked up. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about how marriage within Protestantism has begins to change. Okay. So first and foremost, everybody's equal in the eyes of God. All right. A priesthood of all believers. So that means, spiritually speaking, the man and the woman are equal, okay, from a spiritual standpoint. Now, when it comes right down to it, that don't really matter a whole lot. It don't mean too much, because politically, a woman is still seen as a minor, okay? Like she had the same legal standing as a child, but at least in God's eyes. So maybe that's something that when we talk about the rights of women, slowly over time, developing and gaining some more equality. This is a little tiny equality, a step in that direction. So in the eyes of God, she's seen as the same. Okay. But that don't mean that women are going to be allowed to be preachers. Nope. That's still, it's only men. All right. As in the Catholic Church. Now the church, allows nuns. The Catholic Church allows nuns, but they don't allow women to become ordained priests. Okay. So that is something that's restricted to only men. Okay. Now, when we talk about marriage, the importance of marriage is it is a remedy for lust. Okay, so he says if you get married, go ahead and have sex and all that, and that you should wait to get married before you have sex. But that's a normal part of your human development, your your biology, and that's just the way we're born. But we should do our very best to control it until we get married, and then there you go, have fun, and have lots of children, and raise your children to be God-fearing Christian. And not only is it an antidote for sin, but having a spouse and a loving spouse at that helps that's a companion for you, a lifelong companion, and they can make your life more enjoyable. Okay, now even though in the eyes of God everybody's equal, in the family the man still reigns supreme, and that if his wife is sinful, then because most women were seen because of the stain of Adam and Eve. Remember, it was Eve. She's the temptress, that the woman is more likely to be sinful, so that the man has to be prepared, if necessary, with force to set her on a good path, if that makes sense. But there was limitations legally by what a man could do. It didn't mean that he had the right to beat the tar out of her or anything like that, but he could physically coerce her if necessary. So that's pretty telling that women did not have equality in these German marriages. Okay, but this idea of divorce, okay, which is not something that Catholics can do, because that is one of the sacraments. Okay, and this is important. So if you get married in a church, that means you married under the eyes of God, and there ain't no way you getting a divorce. Okay, unless something major happens. Okay. Of course, obviously, if you become a widow or a widower, you can marry again, obviously. But there's very few exceptions to that rule. All right, there's more today, but back then there were very few. But the Protestants, the Lutherans, begin to see marriage as more of a contract, okay, between two people. And if they aren't kind of upholding, if one party's not upholding their end of the bargain, then they have a responsibility to comfort and support one another. And if one's not doing it, well, by God, we have a right to remove ourselves, to leave that contract, to sever that contract. So the idea of divorce, okay, is possible. Now, since the family, okay, is the bedrock of Western civilization, families are super important. So the idea, just because you can get a divorce, theoretically, doesn't mean very many people did, because that's scandalous. Okay, so you better have a doggone good reason to get a divorce. All right, if you're going to apply for one, because there was today there's people don't really think twice when people get divorced, but back then it was a big deal. Okay, so there you have it. All right. Another change socially that we see as a result of Protestantism, especially Lutheranism, is the idea that prostitution gets attacked. Okay, a little bit more severely than it did in Catholic areas. Prostitution is known as the world's oldest profession, and so it's always been with us. But under the Protestants, they began to police it and do their very best to shut down brothels and arrest women and to just get rid of it entirely. Okay, so from an economic standpoint, and this is actually legitimate, women had one fewer, because a lot of women use prostitution. You can say what you want morally about it, but women used it as an economic stepping stone sometimes, and so they don't get to do that no more. All right, so that's fine, but that was an issue. Okay, Catholics begin to follow suit somewhat, but you see prostitution, for whatever reason, they didn't punish it the same way in Catholic areas as in Protestant areas. So they try to get rid of it then. Okay, now So, what other issue with regards to women, the family, marriage, social issues should we talk about? Well, what about offering women the option of having a spiritual career, if you will, a spiritual vocation? Under Catholicism, even though they're not the same as men and they can't become ordained a priest, they do have the opportunity to become a nun, right? They can take a vow and become a nun. That's just like a female friar. Well, they get rid of all of the friars. In all these Lutheran areas, they confiscate all the church land, all of it. And they send the nuns packing, the friars, the monks, the priests, they send them all, the bishops, they send them all packing. All right, and they confiscate their territory and they start divvying it up. So that means that there is no spiritual opportunity for a woman to exercise her calling, okay? And that also means that they shut down this idea of the cult of Mary. The Virgin Mary, the Blessed Mother, she's very important to Catholics, but she's a saint, all right? And they don't take too kindly to praying to saints and the veneration of the saints because they think that's all hooey. That's all superstitious because that gets linked up with the relics and all that jazz. And so they really begin to de-emphasize that stuff. And so for women, the lives of saints, many of them were female. They served in Mary. They served as an inspiration to them. So all that stuff is now gone. So under Luther, it really becomes a male's world. All right? Hope that makes sense. All right, now we got to finish this thing up. But before we do, we have to see where Martin Luther himself becomes a controversial figure. Okay? And as I mentioned earlier, he needed the support of those princes, those Germanic princes, so that his churches would remain open, and that he needed their support. Otherwise, it's not gonna happen. Okay, so he talked a lot about the idea of the priesthood of all believers. This idea that everybody's equal before the eyes of God. Well, some of his more radical followers began to take his ideas and extrapolate some things out of them that weren't really there, like the idea that everybody's equal politically and socially, this idea of social justice. Well, the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany at this time, is very feudal, okay? And there is a class system, and there's a definite pecking order. And everybody's got to know their place in society. And so some of these more radical thinkers start to equate spiritual equality with political equality, and that the peasants, the poor, are not getting a fair shake. And they misread Luther's writings because they thought that Luther would be sympathetic and supportive. He was sympathetic of their abuses, and he wrote that the Germanic princes should be treating the peasants better. But when it turned violent and there was an uprising, Martin Luther became enraged, okay? And so the peasants had written down their concerns and their gripes, and they said that they were being too heavily taxed, that the Germanic princes were stealing things that didn't belong to them, etc., etc., known as the 12 Articles. And although Luther said, that they should be treated more fairly when things turn violent, he wrote something. He wrote a pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of the Peasants. And he advocated that the nobility put down the rebellion violently and to spare none of the rebels. And as a result of that, some 70 to 100,000 peasants died a very violent death. And so some people think, wow, that's quite a show of unnecessary force. But Martin Luther was very serious when he said that you do not have a right, right? You do not have a right to rebel your political leader, your secular leader. You just gotta suck it up and just deal with it. All right. And so that is quite a statement that he made. And again, I would be remiss if I did not remind you that of course he was going to side with the nobility, because if he sides with the peasants, bye-bye Lutheran churches, if that makes sense. All right. Now, we're going to look at this map here, okay? And what this map is showing you is some of the different religions that exist, but maybe that's not the best map to show you. Let me show you this map right here. Some of the enemies of the Holy Roman Empire, okay? Remember I said there was some political things that took place that needed to take place in order for Luther to not go down the road that some of his, or suffer the same fate that some of his predecessors did. And that is, okay, so Charles V, even though he couldn't arrest him, he could have persisted and, gotten Luther out of the way, but he was preoccupied with other foreign affairs. He had wars to fight, okay? He was fighting against the French in the Habsburg-Valois War. Then, that's on the western front of their empire, and on the eastern front, he's fighting the Ottoman Empire. And you may recall in 1453, Constantinople fell, right? And the Byzantine Empire went kaput. And the Ottomans just kept working their way further and further into southeastern Europe until in 1529, they laid siege to Vienna, which is the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. And so Charles, Chucky V, Charles V, needed the support of the German princes, Lutheran and Catholic. And so he didn't say anything about the Lutheran princes because he needed their support militarily to fight these two enemies on both fronts. Okay, the Frenchies and then the Ottomans. Make sense? All right, so when he finally wrapped up those two conflicts, he turned his attention to Martin Luther and these Protestant or Lutheran princes and said, enough is enough. So he called himself a meeting called the Diet of Augsburg, and it was at this Diet of Augsburg that he gave the Lutheran princes an ultimatum, and he says, you all got to convert back to Catholicism or else. And so they said no. All right, but then they did something else. Okay, they decided that they were fearful of him and that they were vulnerable. And so what they did was they decided to form an alliance system. And this alliance system of the Lutheran princes deciding that, they're promising to help each other should they come under attack. And it was called the Schmalkaldic League. All right? And the Schmalkaldic League was used to fight because once Chucky V gets finished fighting the French and the Ottoman, he turns on his own German princes to try to restore Catholicism. And some people say he wasn't going to stop there, that he was going to bring true consolidation to the Holy Roman Empire, and that it would become more unified like a modern day Germany. All right? So these German princes fought against him. Okay? But what's interesting is the Catholic King of France saw this and was fearful that even though he had been, they had fought a very long war in the Habsburg-Valois War against Charles, that they would at least give support to those Lutheran princes, because if Charles was allowed to be successful and he creates a united Germany, that's a big united country sitting right on their border, and that would make them vulnerable in the future. So they wanted to prevent Germany from being united. So the French Catholic King gives support to the Lutheran princes, which was highly irregular for somebody to support another group that's a different religion at the time. So they fought on and off for a period of time, and then in 1555, kind of in an exhausted state, because he's overseeing such a large empire, he is beginning to, his nerves are frayed, and he wants all of this resolved. So he calls another meeting, and this time he is willing to compromise. And what we come up with is a treaty known as the Peace of Augsburg, and this is 1555. This is one of the more significant dates. This is a turning point in history, okay, in period one. So this is a date y'all need to remember. And the Peace of Augsburg stated the following: it was up to each German prince to decide the religion of his principality, and thereby also deciding the religion of his subjects. So if the Germanic prince or leader of a specific principality was Catholic, that means all of his subjects had to be Catholic, and vice versa. If he's Lutheran, all of his subjects have to be Lutheran. All right? Now, what do we call that? Well, we look at that and we say that that's the first example, really, of any kind of religious toleration whatsoever. Not only that, this is going to say that Lutheranism is here to stay, that Protestantism is, at least Lutheranism, is going to be on the same standing as Catholicism, and the days of Europe being united by one religion are dead. All right, so that wraps it up. That's all I got to say about that.